Hi, everybody. My name is Pavel, and I'll be talking to you about the new SAT verbal section. So, a little bit about me. I've been doing this for over a decade now, and I specialize specifically on the SAT verbal section. And what I realized over the many years of doing this is that ultimately the SAT does a pretty good job of testing students' reading comprehension. What I also noticed is that when I do the SAT questions in a particular way, my chances of getting them right are much higher than if I do it a different way. And so, what I want to talk to you about is my method of approaching a lot of these SAT critical reading questions in particular. I call it the visualization method. And as it sounds like, it's where you try to visualize what you're reading. So, let's take a look. So here I am sharing one of the questions from the Blue Book section, and I believe that the best materials are currently, in fact, on the Blue Book app. So if you haven't downloaded it yet, I encourage you to do so. And this is going to give us the most realistic materials available. So again, I always read the questions. I always read the passages first. I never read the questions first because it's much better to then look at the questions after you've read the passage, so you're not being misled by the way the questions are worded, which is what they'll sometimes do. And so again, what I'm going to try to do as I read this is I'm going to try to make sure that I'm going to visualize as much as possible whatever I'm reading, and I'll share with you what it is that I'm picturing inside my mind. So here we go. I'll go sentence by sentence. And I think this is a perfect example of a question that gives students a lot of trouble because, quite frankly, I think it's a little difficult to visualize. And I think a lot of students will just kind of glance at the words without visualizing anything. And before you know it, they're on the question and looking at the answer choices, and it seems a little confusing. Astronomers are confident that the star Betelgeuse will eventually consume all the helium in its core and explode in a supernova. Okay, so right away, a lot of students might read that and might seem like a foreign language, but I would encourage you again to really visualize that. So what am I picturing? Well, I'm picturing first a bunch of astronomers kind of looking up maybe through it, into the sky. Maybe there's a huge telescope and there's this big star somewhere up in the distance. And all of the helium in its core is going to sooner or later be used up, and then it's going to have a fantastic explosion. So, for anybody wondering, here's something that it might look like. So, what I went ahead and did is I just created a quick AI image to show you more or less what I've been kind of visualizing as well, based on my description. Just like I mentioned, there is a bunch of astrologists or astronomers, I should say, who are looking up into the distance and seeing a big star explode. Now, again, is that really what it looks like? Probably not. Not to mention, it's not exploding right now. It's eventually going to explode. But again, you need to visualize something. And I always say it's better to visualize something, even if it's a little inaccurate, than nothing at all. So that's the picture that I'm currently going with. Now, let's go ahead and get back to the question. And the question in this case, as you may remember, was this one. Keep in mind my time, because I've been creating these images as we go along, is a little bit different than what it would normally be, but nonetheless. There are much less confident, again, who, the astronomers, however, about when this will happen, since that depends on internal characteristics of Betelgeuse that are largely unknown. So now, again, I'm visualizing this same star not necessarily exploding yet, because we don't know when it's going to happen. And it's because we don't know what it's made up of, right? So in our first picture, I wasn't really sure what helium looks like. All we know is that sooner or later the helium will be consumed and it's going to explode. But apparently, what else is inside that star also matters, and that's going to determine how long it'll take for it to explode. All right. Astrophysicist Sarafina El-Badri Nance and colleagues recently investigated whether acoustics waves in the star could be used to determine internal stellar states, but concluded that this method could not sufficiently reveal Betelgeuse's internal characteristics to allow its evolutionary state to be firmly fixed. Now, I have a few rules that I always follow when doing the SAT verbal. Number one, once I start a sentence, I always continue reading it up until I stop. So until the sentence stops. This way, if you ever stop halfway to try to figure out what you just read, you're going to lose your train of thought, and it's going to be much more difficult for you to try to pick up where you left off. So once you start, always start in the beginning of a sentence and always read until the end. With that being said, this was a very long sentence. And so, again, as I was reading it, I was visualizing something, but I'll be able to share with you what I visualized. Another tip that I'm going to share with you right now is what the new SAT really likes to do is, I think on purpose, trip us up with some of these names that are a little difficult to pronounce. I probably butchered that name, but another one of my rules is read it the way you see it and don't worry about it. Because if you try to go back and get it right, that's going to take up more time. And again, you're going to lose your train of thought. But in this case, you have a new set of scientists, astrophysicists in my visualization. They look very similar to astronomers for some reason, but I guess all scientists in many cases do. They're all wearing maybe their lab coats or whatnot. And now they are trying to figure out what these quote unquote acoustic waves in the star are and can they be used to determine when it's going to essentially explode, right? And so, again, this is where I think a lot of students kind of get lost. They don't know what acoustic waves look like. Nobody really does unless you're an astrophysicist. And as a result, I think it makes it very easy to try to just kind of glance at the words and then go to the question. But that's where students get in trouble. Try to still visualize something. Even if, like me, you have no idea what an acoustic wave looks like, especially when it relates to, in this case, stars, still do your best. So here it is. Here's my picture of what I'm visualizing when I read that sentence. And before I share it with you, keep in mind that we ultimately realized that that method of trying to investigate these acoustic waves in the star wasn't helpful at all. And therefore, this method doesn't seem like it's going to work. But before we get there, here's my picture. So again, here's my quick AI image of what I was visualizing. My visualization was a little bit different, but nonetheless, it basically gets the point across. There is a planet. There's some kind of waves inside the planet, according to the passage, and they were trying to use that to figure out what it's composed of. Unfortunately, it wasn't enough, and it seems like this method will fail. So now let's take a look at the questions. And now I'm going to go ahead and go back to the question that we were on. And here it is again. And here you can see that the question is, which choice best describes the function of the second sentence in the overall structure of the text? Now, at this point, another tip, what I like to do is kind of formulate my own answer before looking at the real answers. This way I'm not misled by any of the trickier answers that kind of sound right, but may be wrong. And so again, I'm going to go on a limb here and try to figure out what it is in my own words. And so looking at the underlined sentence, we know the first sentence was about how we know that this star is going to explode sooner or later. However, the second sentence says there are much less confident when this will happen since we don't know the characteristics of this star. So I'm thinking to myself, they're stating a problem to them knowing when it's going to explode, right? That is what's going to kind of hinder them from knowing when it will happen. So now we go one by one. Here's another tip. I always do process of elimination. It is much easier to eliminate the wrong answer choices than it is to arrive at the right one. And so I'm very picky about what words are being used. If I feel like one word is not the right word, a lot of times I'll cross out that answer choice. So A, it describes a serious limitation of the method used by Nance and the colleagues. So on one hand, I think it has a lot of the right things because is that a limitation? Yes. However, is it a limitation to the method used by Nance and our colleagues? Not so sure because the method doesn't come until later, and the method is regarding the acoustic waves. And we don't really know what the limitation to the method is, except that it doesn't quite work. So I might not cross this one out just yet, but I have some reservations about it. I think, if anything, that is a problem to the astronomers, not necessarily a limitation of the method used by Nance. So I'm going to put a question mark here, but I'm skeptical. B, it presents the central finding reported by Nance and the colleagues? No, because in this case, the underlying portion is the problem of why we don't know when this Betelgeuse star is going to explode. It is not a finding. In fact, as far as I can tell, Nance's and her colleagues had no findings. All we know is that this method didn't work. If there was a finding, it was that their method did not give us enough information about Betelgeuse's internal characteristics. C, it identifies the problem that Nance and the colleagues attempted to solve but did not. Well, that sounds pretty good, right? Because in this case, we know that they were trying to figure out if they can understand the internal characteristics of this Betelgeuse star by using this new acoustic waves method, whatever that is. In our visualization, it was that planet with a bunch of waves around it, but they weren't able to do it. They said that they could not sufficiently reveal the characteristics. So this one might very well work. D, it explains how the work of Nance and colleagues was received by others. We have no idea how their work was received by others. We don't know what people's response was to their work. Maybe nobody found out about it because they realized it wasn't going to work. So A, I thought was the second best answer choice, but like we talked about, that even though it was a limitation, it wasn't a limitation on the method that Nance used. Instead, it was a problem that Nance and her colleagues tried to solve but didn't. So again, this was the long-winded explanation for how I go about these problems. But with practice, you can get faster at this. Now, some of you might be saying, well, I don't need to do all this. I could have just quickly got that answer right. Maybe, but keep in mind, the approach is designed to make sure you can not only can you get these questions right, but also some of the hardest questions right. And when you're reading a question on the SAT, you don't know if you're reading the hardest question, medium level question, or maybe even an easy level question. So your approach has to be calibrated to make sure that you can answer even the hardest questions right with that approach. What I think a lot of students sometimes do is they'll kind of start reading it. They're not fully understanding it. They're not visualizing it, which is how you really know you're understanding it. And yes, if it's an easy question, they're fortunate. They don't need to understand it that well. They're getting it right. But when they get to that very difficult question, all of a sudden they realize that their understanding is not enough to answer the question, and they wish that they would have visualized it. So with that, I leave you for this tip and strategy, and I hope to give more in the future. So we'll see how it goes. Thanks so much. Bye.